everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be speaking all things talent and talent development. And I say talent, I don't know if that's going to be the right word to use. We're going to find out lots of questions around talent and its definition. We're going to be speaking about this topic with Professor Joe Baker. Joe, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks, Dan. I'm happy to be here.
It's been an ambition of mine for quite a long time to drag you on here, and what a brilliant excuse to bring you on. You've written a book. We're going to be talking all about that, but we'll start where we always start. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm Joe Baker. My full-time job is as a professor at York University in Toronto, Canada, and in my spare time, I like to write books that hopefully people will read and travel around the world, talking to coaches, trying to help them do what they do better.
You say travel around the world. I follow your Twitter timeline studiously, and yet you seem to be present on all four corners of the globe quite often.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a whirlwind last couple of months. South America, Singapore, Germany last week. It's been a bit of a wild ride, but the discussions we've been having have just been phenomenal. So no regrets.
Professor Baker on tour.
Yeah, what I've sorted out is the rock star lifestyle is just not one that I could ever get accustomed to. So, learning lessons as we go.
You need some roadies to help you, I reckon. that's the key. Now, look, you've written this book. It's a fantastic book. It's entitled Tyranny of Talent. Great title, Tyranny of Talent. How it compels and limits athletic achievement and why you should ignore it. I suppose the first question, Joe, is why a book on talent?
Yeah, I think our first endeavors in this area were around deliberate practice. We were the quantification and understanding the role of practice in athlete development, and we did that for about 10 years. And we kept running up against this word talent when we talked to coaches, and so rather than go around it, we decided we were going to go through it. And so we started unpacking what this means, and it really is a tyrannical word in high performance sport and the way that we think about coaching, particularly young kids. And so what we wanted to do was just summarize what we know about this concept, what we can use that actually has value and utility for practitioners, and then try to get us to ignore all the stuff that interferes with the way that we think about athlete development and the way that we can coach young kids better.
Well, there's 235 pages of gold dust in here, and you start the book by proposing that, hey, look, talent is real, but we think about it wrongly. Talent is real, but we think about it wrongly. I mean, unpack that a little bit for me. In what way are we thinking about talent that is wrong? And look, talent is real. Clearly we look around us and we see people who are able to do things better than others and probably quicker than others. So that's probably undeniable, isn't it? But you're claiming that we're thinking about this wrongly.
Yeah, I think the important distinction that we make is between talent as a scientific concept, which is that there are differences between people that are going to end up making impact on their likelihood of success in whatever it is. If, basketball is the greatest example. If your predicted height is 7 feet, you've got an advantage over someone whose predicted height is 5 feet. That's just the reality of the demands of that sport. Where we think about it wrong is when we look at somebody's performance at U7 or U9 and assume that the way they're performing at that moment is predictive of how they're going to perform 10 years or 15 years later. And so where we get talent wrong is thinking about it as a fixed quantity that is observable in really simple ways, using the simple tests that we researchers or coaches use to assess athletes. And when we do that, we assume that this thing we're measuring has some kind of predictive utility, and the research suggests the opposite, that we see very little transfer from junior to senior levels of performance. The long-term efficacy of our selection decisions is not very good. And so with that kind of evidence, the whole phenomenon of early selection is kind of undermined. And so we know that early selections impact athletes' long-term development by providing opportunities to some that others don't get. And those opportunities are actually the things that make the big difference in the long run. And again, it comes back almost full circle to this idea of quality and quantity of practice. And if you do anything that impedes a person's ability to do more practice or to do better practice, you're making a impact on their long-term development.
The book is split into 3 sections. Section 1, you entitle The Setup. I'd like to unpack that. I think you've done that a little bit there in a nutshell, but perhaps we can speak more to that. I mean, listening to you there, it feels like we don't want to be thinking in terms of nature versus nurture, but perhaps nurtured nature, maybe. But essentially, chapters 1 to 3. I mean, if we were to break this down and go through the book, and perhaps you can pick out some important highlights for us here. In chapter 1 to 3, you kind of lay a broad foundation for discussing talent in sport. That's how you open this book. Do you want to speak to that a little bit for us?
Sure, and that was on purpose, and really it was because of lessons that I was learning when I went back to look at the real early stuff and why we started with this distinction that has stood the test of time of nature versus nurture, setting up this very adversarial dichotomy between these two categories of variables. And so I went back to Francis Galton's original work, which I've always been interested in him as a character. And so looking at his original work in this area and how impactful that was, and how interesting it is that somebody with a good idea can affect the long-term science and in a very profound way. And so I think we can't solve a problem until we understand the origins of it. And so those early chapters were really around, why do we think about talent in this way? Why did we set it up as a dichotomy in the first place? At the time when Galton was doing his work, we had very exciting research happening on genes and human evolution, and we didn't have to set it up as a dichotomy. We could have set it up as a really complicated process. And so one of the early chapters is called Blame Galton. And I think it really is his fault that we sort of set it up as this dichotomy, which has been the way we've thought about achievement and development since that day forward. And that's what we're trying to move away from in the book, trying to look at the complexity of human development and human achievement and say, you know what, we can't break it into these simple categories. And when we do that, we actually we do a disservice to how complicated it is, the job that coaches have to do, the jobs that parents have to do.
Did Galton declare that it's nature and not nurture, or the other way around?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at his early work in the area, although he's known as the nature guy because of heritability and inheritance and tracking family lineages and that kind of stuff. He wasn't ignorant to the impact of the environment. He just said that the impact was minimal compared to the impact of hereditary factors. And I think Galton was a little bit jealous of his cousin Darwin, who had this monstrously impressive, quantifiable approach to the world. And he tried to develop the same kind of thing for human achievement. And so I think, maybe purposely oversimplified the arguments so that it looked a bit more global and a bit more general than it actually ended up being.
Familial rivalry drove cognitive bias.
Yeah.
Okay. So perhaps because of Galton and maybe other factors and the spread of this notion of nature over nurture from the beginning. I assume over time some other voices sort of said, well, hang on a minute, no, let's look at nurture rather than nature. And really you're coming from the position here. It's, hey, come on, guys, it's a little bit of both here. So you're taking a more, I suppose, more sophisticated viewpoint, a more complex and nuanced approach to this problem of talent and what it is. You follow this up by a conversation around research of exceptional performance. Can you tell us a little bit about this chapter and kind of how it fits in with the conversation here?
Yeah, I think you're referring to maybe the chapter on intelligence and how we moved forward with that movement that occurred maybe 20 years after Galton's major achievement and his impact on the field was the emergence of intelligence as a quantifiable thing that society was starting to use more often to put people into boxes. This is a person with high intelligence and therefore high potential. And so that was really impactful. It continues to be impactful today. It's the way we still stream our education systems based on early measures of cognitive performance, who gets to go into a gifted program and who gets to maybe get some provision for learning difficulties. That was very impactful, not just in education, but in sport as well. And so, again, this sort of borrowing of ideas from other fields, we started to look as researchers in sport to see if there was an equivalent of general intelligence in a sports setting. And so this originally emerged as the general motor ability concept in the 1940s and 50s, the idea that there would be a general capacity that would explain why some people are good at sports the way that intelligence explains why some people are good at cognitive things. The amount of support for this concept was a little bit flimsy, though, and perhaps because it was hard to quantify and measure in a valid and reliable way. Perhaps because the notion is, again, too simple. Again, because the notion of a general motor ability is somewhat absent of the learning environment and the experience that a person gets. It puts it all on the heritable elements of performance, that it's something that you can identify early. This person, in the way that they perform a motor task, has an ability that other people don't have, or a greater ability than other people have, and that's something quantifiable. And so, again, the same way we think about intelligence, we're starting to think about motor performance and sport performance. And luckily, that phenomenon didn't last very long, because I think, at the same time, we were starting to see the impact of the environment, the classic studies on learning effects, the studies that would inform the power law of practice that we would talk about a couple decades later, that if people continue to practice, if they keep training, they can get better at things, which kind of undermines this idea that it's a general ability that some people have and other people don't.
And speaking to, the continuation of practice, the final parts of this section address, I suppose, the two big hitters of this debate: practice and genetic factors. Historically, I've picked up books, Talent is Overrated by Jeff Colvin, which is a couple of decades old now. And obviously the main one here in the UK that came through was Bounce by Matthew Syed. Many authors have got involved in this, Joe. Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell. All, I'm assuming, well-meaning in their authorship of these books. But it would be interesting to get some insights from you with regard to the role of practice, and I'm assuming here you're writing about the research here, the role of practice and genetic factors.
Yeah, I think and this goes back to our earliest research in this field, that practice is probably, well, maybe not even probably, absolutely the number one predictor of a person's level of skill and attainment. But practice has always kind of been positioned on the nurture side of the argument. And what we were trying to say in those couple of chapters is that your interest and ability to sustain practice could have a genetic origin. That there are some people that like to do monotonous practice or like to experience those challenging sensations that go along with high quality practice, and there are some people that don't enjoy that at all. And you can't just assume that the work ethic or the interest or the drive is going to be similar across individuals. And so what we were trying to do with those chapters was to build the argument that, hey, there's something more complicated going on here. That if you look at the end of the journey and you look at two performers, absolute number of hours of practice is probably going to predict who ends up where. But that doesn't mean practice is the only variable, or it doesn't mean that hereditary factors or genetic factors aren't involved. And one of the things we talk about in the genetics chapter is the role of certain genetic markers that are emerging that can predict injury risk. And that's maybe the cleanest example of where genetic factors can affect ability to practice. So there's genetic markers for risk of Achilles tendon injury. And so if you have the positive marker in that genetic profile, you're going to be able to do a different kind of training than someone who has a negative marker. At the end of the day, it'll look like training is the difference between those people, but it starts at the beginning with the genetic factors that they begin their athlete journey with.
It's fascinating, and as you were speaking there, I was thinking of a lot of things. I was thinking about my own golf career and how I would practice. This is a case study of one here, Joe. But practice, and walk off the practice ground after eight hours grinding, which now I know as a sports psychologist, helping people to practice effectively, that was a very ineffective way to practice. However, I would still walk off that practice ground, and just there was just something about holding a golf club in my hand that still felt uncomfortable. And there's just something about, let's say, a Rory McIlroy who would stand there and his sensitivity to that practice. I just think, that there was so much more flexibility there for him. He would just get better quicker, and he would get better as a consequence of all the practice he was putting in. And the other thing that was coming in and out of my mind was, the books I've read and the experiences I've had of listening to speakers who have talked about, let's just say, for instance, Kenyan distance running, from this small town in Iten, in Kenya, where so many champions have come through. And again, it's just making me think of that practice and genetic propensity. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of my thoughts there, but that was kind of what was flying in and out of my mind.
Well, I think it's like the Kenyan running is such a great example of the complexity of this kind of phenomenon we're talking about. If you go there, it would be easy to say, well, there's some kind of genetic predisposition in people from East Africa that are going to lead them to greater success. But when you actually hear the stories of how their culture is structured and the kind of impact the runners have in their communities and the feedback that they get from parents and peers and coaches, there could be a genetic thing. I don't think the jury's still out on that. I don't think they've identified any clear markers there, but the culture is also one that is super supportive of the development of those kinds of things. And so, it's interesting if we come to Canada and you see almost the same thing in ice hockey, where every young Canadian child is at the rink, they're practicing, it's the thing that they do, but no one would say, well, Canadians have a gene for ice hockey. Well, no, it's the culture, the environment that's surrounding that person during key stages of their development that is leading to those kinds of outcomes. Genes are probably involved, but maybe not in the kind of specific way that we think they are when we try to group people in terms of geographic regions having maybe disproportionate likelihoods of success.
And just as you're speaking now, I mean, the book that's entering my mind here is The Goldmine Effect by Rasmus Ankerson, which you're nodding there, which I'm sure you've read. And, thinking of other examples here, Russian tennis, for example, Jamaican sprinting, and from my own sport, South Korean women's golf. And, on the South Korean women's golf, because it's my own sport, I have a little bit more knowledge of that. And And it was just a few years ago where the former world number one Inbee Park, came out and said, "I've got to get a hobby because I'm burning out here. I'm exhausted." And she subsequently retired. But I think that, and I'm going to absolutely get this data point wrong, so I'm not even going to mention it, but there was something like, there was a few years ago, there was X amount of South Korean golfers in the world's top 10, top 20, absolutely dominated golf, less so now, but they were dominating golf. And sort of we looked at that as the model, but from a psychosocial perspective, so many South Korean women golfers left the sport quite quickly, my understanding. Probably as a consequence of burnout. So again, we're talking about the practice, the endless hours of practice early, but leading to burnout, and then an earlier than normal exit from the sport.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, maybe we don't make this distinction quite as clear as it should be in the book, but the difference between a system that's effective, where if you've got unlimited people and you just get them to practice all the time, you'll have success. But that doesn't mean you have a system that's efficient. And I think in a lot of sports, a lot of countries, the emphasis needs to be on efficiency because we don't have unlimited numbers of athletes that we can just burn out through a massive deliberate practice regimen. We've got to manage these athletes. We've got to nurture these athletes. We don't want to deselect them early because they may have better talent and we need them in the system later to be the superstars. And so if we shift the discussion from can we do it to a should we do it, I think that we get a different equation for how we develop those athletes.
And that effectiveness and efficiency, I suppose, gold standard approach. It makes me think of the importance of multidisciplinary teams, for instance, I suppose at the elite level, but certainly upskilled and educated coaches in developmental pathways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're starting to see that trickle down into the coach education systems now. The real leaders in the high performance space are recognizing that, hey, sometimes the most important coach is the one at the developmental level, at the youth level. And so we shouldn't be using all of our coach education and opportunities for the elite level because those people at the elite level don't need the same kind of supports as those at the younger level.
Hey, look, you unpack this so well in section 1. In section 2, entitled Compromising Greatness, you speak more towards athletic development, what helps it go right, and understanding what's happening when it goes wrong. Chapter 7, you talk about the power of being labelled talented or not talented. Can you speak to that a little bit, Joe?
This was one of the really miraculous things that I found in the research for the book was how little we actually know about the power of these kind of labels, because those labels are everywhere, and not just in sport, but in education, in almost everything we do, especially early in our development. People like to put labels on us. And we know almost nothing about the impact of these labels. There's a couple of studies in gifted education that suggest that when we put a label of talented on someone, it undermines the relationships between other people in the family that don't get that label. And that when we put labels of not talented on people, it can undermine their motivation and interest and drive. And so all this to say, we better be right in the labels that we put on people, especially early in their development, because the consequences are pretty damning. And so this was the struggle for us, was now that we know that there's implications and consequences to these labels, how do we manage that? Because we can't just say, in a youth development system, we're going to keep everybody indefinitely forever, because we don't have the resources to be able to do that. We don't have the high quality coaching. We don't have the facilities. We don't have the time. And so what's the solution? I think this is a really important question for people in high performance sport, is how do you manage that phenomenon? Not just for those who are deselected, which is maybe the most important group, but for the ones that are selected. The evidence that we have is that even those that are told that they're talented across the entire pathway may not get a beneficial experience from that, because again, if we do anything that undermines motivation and striving to work hard, like telling somebody they have natural talent and don't need to work hard, could have long-term implications for their development.
Yeah, I mean, relating to the relationship between labels and motivation obviously makes me think of a specific set of studies. And obviously, right now, growth mindset is having a bit of a replicability crisis. There's a lot of indifference to it right now after a lot of support to it. I think again, somewhat stepping away from science from my own personal experience, my experiential stuff, is that I've certainly had conversations with a great many young players over the years who have been told that they're talented, and subsequently they seem to have what could be perceived as a fixed mindset. Again, stepping aside the controversy over growth, fixed mindset, is it real, is it not real, what is it? That does seem, that in my experience has seemed to be the case, that telling players that they're talented very early, it's almost as if they become a bit protective of it. That's just my own personal experience.
I think that distinction's important, though, and maybe the research on growth mindset is having a hard time being replicated. At least the size of the effects that were originally found in those studies. I think the effect is still there. It's just a lot more muted than it was originally, and I think for me that's. We could look at that from a regression to the mean perspective, that this is probably more accurate and a more realistic effect, that it's going to affect some people in profound ways, some people not at all. And the median or mean effect is going to be somewhere in the marginal range. That's human behavior, right? Like there's 1,000 variables interacting at any one time on us. And sometimes it's going to be mindset. Sometimes it's going to be grit. Sometimes it's going to be something else entirely. What I what I'm hoping coaches take away from the discussion in the book is that this is a really complex mosaic of variables here, and not to throw mindset out, but just to recognize that for some people, mindset is going to be that variable, that message that you give them is going to be profound. And so, well, pay attention to the language that you're using and the potential for consequence. And if we do that, we're more likely to have approaches to coaching that are more positive and adaptive for everyone, regardless of what those variables end up being.
We're not here to talk much about growth mindset, but just to comment on what to comment on that. We love answers, don't we? In life,
Yeah.
human beings love an answer, love a clear-cut solution, a black and white solution. But we do live in the grey, and development is very much in the grey, isn't it? And thus, noise and complexity are the norm in development.
Yeah, which if I've gotten any pushback on the book so far, it's that there's no solution at the end, and I think that's because there is no single solution, and so you should be wary of people that say that it's one thing, it's grit or it's mindset or it's range or it's deliberate practice or whatever. It's if we want to explain a population of athletes, it's all of those things in interaction. If we want to look at a single person's journey, we need to pay more attention to the nuance. We need to pay more attention to the complexity and noise in that individual.
And talking about noise and complexity and challenges, chapter 8 talks about, you've spoken to this a little bit already, but chapter 8 talks about the developmental environment and how our environments that develop players has changed over the last couple of decades, hasn't it? As sport has evolved, I suppose, into this global phenomenon where athletes can become superstars and so on and so forth. Tell me a little bit about what you spoke about in this chapter.
The reality is the world of sport has changed and is continuing to change. The amount of money, the amount of people, the quality of developmental environments has become so specific and developed that we need to recognize that this has implications for the way that we think about athlete development. And our research group wrote a paper a couple of months ago where we talked about the problem with looking at people at the end of their journey right now and assuming that we can take lessons from what they experienced as youth to design environments for today's youth. This idea of survivor effects as being this phenomenally important bias that we have in most sports science research. And it's become more relevant than ever because of the speed at which sport is changing. And so I think of our early work on sampling and diversification in high performance sport. When we're talking about athletes that grew up in the 1980s and early 1990s, that is a different ecosystem of athlete development than what athletes are experiencing today. And so that's not to say we can't learn lessons from that, but we need to recognize the differences between the environments of yesterday and the environments of today. And if we don't do that, we run the risk of designing policies that would have been really relevant 20 years ago, but have little relevance today. That's the power of the developmental environment. And I'm not sure we really understand the differences between those things. We still look at the people that are at the top of the game right now and trying to learn lessons about how we can help youth that are growing up in a completely different ecosystem.
That's really fascinating, looking at the sports stars of today, or the ones that we interview who were brilliant a decade or 2 decades ago, doesn't necessarily leave clues to how we should help our young people develop today. And funnily enough, we've actually just recently released an episode of the Sports Psych Show with Dr. Julie Johnston and Joseph Stanford, who have done some research around Generation Z athletes, and how we develop them, how we communicate with them, how we deal with them, and one of the big topics of conversation with them was around technology. That the answers to so many coaching solutions are at the touch of a button for young people, and so subsequently that, for instance, does put pressure on the importance of coach-athlete relationships. That I suppose the stuff I do a lot, the psychosocial skills and so on and so forth. I think that's what you've said there is, and what you address in this chapter is really, really interesting. That we can't just go, well, this person was a wonderful competitor a decade ago, this legend of the game. Let's talk to him. Let's interview her about this. Let's interview them about this because we can get clues. Well, maybe not.
Yeah, and I think there are some universals, time on task,
Sure.
amount of practice, those kinds of things, but it's the predictors of those universals that are changing over time. So why would a child in the 1980s or early 1990s spend more time in unstructured practice? Well, because sport wasn't delivered in a structured way like it is now. And so, well, how do we get the same effect in the new environment? That should be the question that we're focusing on, not how do we recreate the past. I don't think that's that rose-colored glasses sort of perspective is the one to take. It's the world has changed. What can we learn, and how do we optimize that effect in the new environment? We're not going to get people to give up their iPhones and go off social media. So let's not even try to do that. How can we embrace those technologies, maybe in a way that allows us to optimize the environment?
It makes me think of the conversation we had with Dr. Jamie Taylor about epistemological change. I'm proud of myself for being able to say epistemological. Where do coaches get their knowledge from? And I think historically, coaches haven't always looked to research. They've perhaps looked to mentors and friends who are coaches, who have coached in their context, and perhaps haven't had an environment that helps them to critically appraise what they're doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it. And so subsequently, they don't necessarily develop the kind of knowledge that would be more useful for the people in front of them. They don't necessarily see coaching as a mini experiment every day that they try to update and develop and improve upon. It's just, this is what we did in the past. We're just going to do that now. It's a cut and paste approach.
Which I think works in certain circumstances.
Yes.
When you've got an environment that is relatively stable, and maybe the one at the high performance level is, of all coaching environments, it's the one that has maybe stayed as the most stable over
Yes.
time. And it might have very little relevance at the developmental level, which is probably the one that's at the greatest degree of flux and instability.
The next two chapters excite me because they are enveloped in the word myth. I always love a myth because it always neatly courts controversy. Chapter 9, myth: sport is a meritocracy with everyone having potential for success. And then chapter 10, myth: sport is an overwhelmingly positive environment for human development. Let's tackle meritocracy first. Surely, Joe, everybody has the potential for success.
Well, that is controversial for sure. I think it's so. Again, if we agree that talent is a variable that is normally distributed, then some people are going to have more talent than others. I
Yes.
think the interesting thing in sports setting is that there's not just a single combination of variables that explains the elite performer. If there was, sport would be boring, right? There's lots of people doing lots of different things. Some are more physically dominant, some are better decision makers, some are more creative. That's the variability that we see in elite sport. And there's any number of combinations that you can get to make up that level of success. And so you can still get there with the talent argument. It's if you're not tall, then you need to be a better decision maker, or you need to be faster, or you need to be smarter. What the myth of equal potential is around the idea that even if we have the same degree of talent, the environment that we find ourselves in is going to constrain our ability to develop and demonstrate that talent. So if relative age effects is one of the most widely known, if we're relatively advantaged in terms of our age compared to our peers, then it's going to look like we're better, more powerful, stronger, but in fact we're just older. Relative age effects are important variables early in the developmental pathway. When we make selections early, we're more likely to confuse talent with just chronological age. How much time have you spent on the planet? In 5-year-olds, the difference between a relatively oldest and relatively youngest within the same age group is 20% of their lifespan. Well, that's a massive amount of experience that relatively older people have been able to get. That's just one of the variables that affects the individual's potential for further development in the athlete pathway. Socioeconomic status affects the kind of sport experience you get. If you have the financial resources to pay for more coaching, to pay for better training, to be able to travel to better facilities, you're going to get an advantage over people who don't have that, because you're going to be able to spend more quality time on task. And again, it comes back to time on task being the most important predictor, but it's built on a architecture of opportunity and privilege. And if we don't recognize that, we'd make the mistake of assuming that certain groups have talent-based advantages over other groups, but they're more about opportunity than they are about stable biological differences.
There are so many factors within that environmental factor, isn't there? And just as you're speaking there, you refer to, coaching opportunities. I mean, the quality of the coaching you potentially receive, quality being a number of factors: the quality of the coach-athlete relationship, that coach's ability to establish a relationship with you if you're thinking about the psychosocial side of things, but also the coach's knowledge and the coach's capacity to communicate that knowledge, the will to communicate that knowledge, and the coach's care and attention around the detail. again, a personal experience. I was a keen bowler in cricket at school, and the coach said to me, well, I want you to bowl faster, but was left stumped and clueless when I asked, well, how can I do that? Very lovely coach, but perhaps, a school teacher coach who perhaps at that time lacked a little bit of knowledge around the specifics of how to help me bowl quicker. I wouldn't have gone on and become a first-class cricketer, I have to say, but it's those mini experiences. Even I became a professional golfer, but when I go back, I wish I'd had a coach when I was very, very young to teach me about, let's say, the 5 laws of the golf swing. I'm not going to get too geeky here about golf, but you reflect back and think, wow, there were so many windows of opportunity of learning that I missed because perhaps the coaching I experienced wasn't good enough. And it does leave you a bit head scratchy around, oh, could I have been better as a consequence of that? And it kind of, as a former professional sports person, it leaves you thinking, hey, there was a couple of hinge factors in there that were environmentally related, coaching related, that, hey, I had no control over at all.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the talent argument, it doesn't undermine the importance of coaching. If anything, it emphasizes the importance of coaching, because the educated and knowledgeable coach would be able to look at you and say, the arm action is there, but the velocity isn't, and so here's how we work on that, right? And so, like the thing we have to move away from is that talent is this fixed thing that's going to show up the same way in every athlete at the same point in their development. Well, no, that's a fantasy. What's going to happen is you're going to see your athletes emerge at different rates and in different potentials at different points in time. And you need to be attuned enough to be able to identify, well, what's the key thing that I need to work on now? That puts a lot of emphasis on the coach's education and the coach's skill.
Interesting. And moving on to this second myth, sport as an overwhelmingly positive environment for human development. There's a lot of conversation around this on, social media, that sport needs to be a positive environment for human development. How do you tackle this conversation, Joe?
I think I should start with my sort of caveat, which is I think sport is the greatest environment that's ever been created for realizing human potential. I don't think there's any other environment that's even close. That's different from saying it's a perfect environment for everyone all the time. And I think we've got real problems in sport that we need to deal with. The potential for athlete abuse, the certain cultural elements of certain team sports that can get in the way of people realizing their potential. I think we need to recognize that, and we need to have honest conversations about certain types of sports and the things that they're related to and the outcomes that they provide, and as a society decide whether we want to endorse those things. I think some sports are having those conversations now, and I think they're important to have. But again, it starts from this: we can't just paint sport as this environment for positive youth development without recognizing that there's also potential for negative consequences. Both sides of that coin need to be discussed. I think if we do that, if we have a real honest discussion of sport, all of the negatives, and put them up against the positives, overwhelmingly the scale is going to be balanced on the positive side. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to figure out ways that we can improve the delivery of that. And I think in high performance sport, with the stress and the greater potential for negative outcomes, it's maybe more important to be having those conversations in the high performance space.
I don't want to caricature a very important and complex conversation around abuse in sport, but with relation to talent, it does seem that maybe some part of abuse in sport for developing elite athletes stems from perhaps this overly simplistic viewpoint of talent. You are talented, thus you have to sacrifice everything and work so extraordinarily hard, and thus that's going to drive my philosophies either as a parent or as a coach. That this overly simplistic viewpoint that you're talking about in this book can be an underpinning factor when it comes to or causality when it comes to abuse in sport.
I think that's exactly right. Is the idea that the only variable that matters is the amount and quality of training, and without recognizing that, again, there's going to be individual differences between the amount and the response to that training across all of your athletes. And so, I think I make this point in the book, but it's certainly come up in the conversations we've had over the last few weeks, is that let's recognize that most parents are not monsters that want to live through their kids, that they're there and they're putting their kids in sports programs because they want the best experience for their child. And where they go wrong is because they're not educated enough to know what that best experience is. And so our goal should be, well, how do we educate them? How do we get them to stop yelling at coaches and refs, and because they're doing it because they think their child is being disadvantaged or not being treated fairly? Well, let's be more active. Let's educate them on why they shouldn't do that, and let's have an understanding of what the parent's role is in that scenario. Parents, if you don't give them a role, they'll force themselves into one. And so how do we control that? Well, we say, here's the role of you as a parent. These are the things I want you to do. I want you to sit back. I want you to pay attention to the game. I want you to have a good conversation on the way home that promotes motivation and interest and enjoyment. And here's what I don't want you to do. I don't want you to yell at the refs. I don't want you to, just give them a to-do and not to-do list. And when we don't do that, I think we leave the potential for these negative experiences.
And it's really interesting listening to what you were saying there. It made me think of the challenge of communicating the message, because I think there are better messages now, but often they're the reserve of those institutions that have enormous amount of resources. So, for instance, we've had some fantastic conversations on the Sports Psych show with sports psychologist Elliot Newell, who does some fantastic work at the English Institute of Sport, and he talked about helping coaches within English Institute of Sport create environments that are actually understanding that complexity and nuance of being a human being, and that rest and recuperation is important, and an individual having training environments that are individual specific and to the needs of the individual. And so balancing stretch and support, if you like. But that's the English Institute of Sport. Now you dive onto Twitter, that I know we're both on, and you see these memes about grinding and the late great Kobe Bryant, and how he used to get up at 4 a.m. to shoot 200 baskets in isolated practice, and you're just thinking, wow, and the thing is, Joe, is those are the ones that get 45,000 likes. And that's the challenge here. And there's this continuous narrative. I mean, I recently wrote a short article. There's been this wonderful documentary on Channel 4 here in the UK about Crystal Palace Football Academy, who opened their doors, and fair play to them. And now, this isn't a comment on them as a club or coaches, because they're wonderful coaches and wonderful people. But the narrative was often, you heard it, whether it was parents or players, and sometimes coaches themselves, hard work, it's hard work, it's hard work, it's hard work, it's hard work. And I wrote a little piece saying we need to educate to actually broaden, well, what does hard work mean? And is it always hard work, but is it sometimes taking a step back? What does that look like? And so there's no question here, Joe, but it's just speaking to what you're saying. But it's an enormous challenge, because the memes out there tend to be grind and hard work, and you have to control your effort, energy, and attitude, and you must do this, and musts, and awfulizing and catastrophizing, and it's far away from really where we need to be.
I agree. And I think it's this oversimplification of what is a really complicated psychological gymnastics that's occurring, right? It's if we were able to talk to Kobe Bryant and talk to him about that time, I bet you he would say that it didn't feel like work. Right. And so this emphasis on hard work and lack of enjoyment, and, this putting yourself through discomfort, That's not the experience that most high performance athletes report. They report enjoyment in those things that the average person would say that, hey, I don't want to do that. And I think that, my background in distance running is that made it very clear to me. In distance running, one of the most enjoyable workouts that people have is running intervals on the track. You run them at a pace that oftentimes you're throwing up on the side of the track after your laps are done, and you would ask them, was that enjoyable? They would say, yeah, that was great. The average person would not respond in that way. And so I think we need to make a distinction between, yeah, the average person would say that's hard work, but the expert performer, the elite performer would say, no, that's just, I like doing that. And so for me, the question is, why do they like doing that?
Yeah.
And so again, it comes back to this psychological variables that may just differ between people, and maybe it's they learn to like it in that way because they see the future consequence. Maybe they start that way. Maybe they're higher in conscientiousness and introversion, and so they're just wired to be more to get more enjoyment out of those kinds of activities. Again, we're looking at the question from too simple a perspective.
Uh, Enjoying interval training and vomiting sounds like psychopathy, Joe. It sounds like the dark triad of
Yes,
low agreeableness to me.
there's another research question for us.
Indeed. Let's move on to section 3, where you mentioned earlier that there are no solutions here, but you do entitle this "On Solutions," and you give us a wonderful Occam's razor reference, simple enough but no simpler. And you start this section by saying, hey, look, we need a more comprehensive definition of talent. So what is this comprehensive definition of talent?
This is one that we've developed in our research group over the last few years. And what it does is it focuses on talent not as a fixed entity, but as a process, and which is kind of a get out of jail free card because it's hard to put your finger on it and define it at any point in time. But I think when we do that, again, we make the distinction between talent as something with scientific relevance. It emerges, it's dynamic, it's multidisciplinary, and something that's and talent as a practical, utility-driven variable, which I think for coaches we would say it has very little relevance to you as a coach because it's a process, because it's complicated and emergent and dynamic. You're not going to capture that noise in your assessments of athletes. And so our advice is don't do it. Try not to do it whenever possible because it's too complicated to capture. It's easy for us to talk about it from a thought exercise perspective in theoretical models. It's a different beast entirely to say, hey, coaches, here's how you measure it. That was really the purpose of that definition of talent, was to capture all of the nuance and sophistication related to this as a concept. And then in the subsequent chapters to talk about why we need to move away from it. I think that's maybe the biggest message in the book, is that this is a complicated web of variables interacting across development, across time, and you're not going to be able to capture it with the simple approaches that we've been taking so far.
And so subsequently see a learning journey as a process?
I think if we focus on the learning elements of it, if we focus on providing, giving more agency to the athletes actually in the system to decide the level of their input, give them appropriate challenge, provide them with exposure to as many opportunities as possible, give them the opportunities to work hard. The ones that are wired for hard work, the ones that are more talented and are getting more competence feedback from their experience, the ones that are more driven for achievement and competition, they're going to thrive in that environment. But the good news is everyone else is going to thrive in that environment as well. They're going to find something in that environment that's going to tick that enjoyment or motivation box for them. And so if our goal is not just to produce the 0.01% of elite performers, but to design a society where everybody loves sport because they had positive experiences, then that would be the approach to take. Focus on the learning as opposed to the identification and selection.
The psychologist in me, listening to you speak there, goes straight to self-determination theory, autonomy, competence, and belonging. A big slice of that on that learning journey.
Yeah, and I think that's the part that we miss in the high performance sport environment is we focus on the competence elements, and we undermine or undervalue the belongingness and the connection and the autonomy elements. And so if there's no reason why we can't try to meet all of those basic needs, particularly in youth development, where we don't know who's better suited to be in our talent pathway, and if we have one goal, it's to make sure we don't undermine a person's long-term motivation for sport. When we focus on competency, we tick the box for everybody who's motivated by competency and peer comparison, but we undermine the people that are maybe there at that point in time for social reasons or for autonomy.
You speak of the importance of connection, relationships. Chapter 13, you talk about personal psychology. And it sounds like you're asking questions around part of the solutions here is you're curious, you're inquiring around personal psychology, the personal psychology required to develop the skills needed for greatness. We need to know more about this.
I think so. This comes out of the work that we've been doing over the last, I think it's almost 10 years now, with Brad Young's group at the University of Ottawa on the importance of self-regulation skills. And we always look at self-regulation skills from an intervention standpoint. How can we help athletes develop these skills so that they can be better at regulating their own practice and learning and that kind of thing? And it always struck me that certain personality types are going to do this better just from the get-go. Like if you're a conscientious person, and I'm high in conscientiousness, I like making lists, and it's a great thing when you can draw a line through something and look at the end of the day and see all the things that you've accomplished. My wife is the exact opposite. She's a whirlwind of chaos, and that's just the personality type that she is. We both get lots accomplished, but we get there in different ways. And so for me, I think if we understood, again, looking at this from these are psychological traits that have high degrees of heritability. These are ones that are more learned skills over time, and not put everything into a single box, but recognize that there are some things that are going to be stable, some things that are going to be highly changeable, and try to come up with a profile that could fit every single athlete's needs and desires. Then again, we're acknowledging the complexity and sophistication of this thing that we're trying to explain.
Well, as a sports psychologist who's quite geeky around personality psychology, it's what personality scientists are saying is it's not that somebody is the same way all the time. It's that personality is a typical response across given environments. Of course, we know that our personality flexes depending on the environment or the situation you find yourself in. But as you've said yourself there, yourself, whether you've done a gold standard personality inventory or you haven't, that you're quite a high conscientious person. We spoke on the Sports Psych show to Professor Dan McAdams from Northwestern University, and one of the world's leading, if not the world's preeminent researchers in personality development, personality over the lifespan. And he said, look, there's no right and wrong with personality, but there may be personality traits that are to be encouraged in, let's say, high performance environments, and high conscientious is one of them. Probably lower neuroticism, probably slightly higher openness, because that's akin to when people talk about the importance of being coachable, being more open, being slightly higher agreeable, probably lend themselves towards that.
Well, and if you were to look at those traits in a not from a prescriptive or a deterministic way, but how can you learn more about your athletes that are going to help you be a better coach, and affect the way that you tailor message to them, or learning environments to them? Then I don't see how it could be anything but a positive thing, right? It's we're not using it in a way that's going to say we're only going to select athletes that are high in conscientiousness, because that would be a bad idea. But can you design an environment that is is equally optimized for people that are high in conscientiousness and those who are currently low in conscientiousness, which I think is really important early in the developmental pathway, when there might be lots of room for adjustment in people's personality according to the big five.
Chapter 14 closes the book, and here you emphasize the importance of development as a process. So we talked a little bit about that already. Development as a process that can be nurtured and improved. Almost coming back to that growth mindset type scenario. Not an equation to be solved. What's the dichotomy there? What do you mean by that?
The work that we've done with a lot of high performance sport organizations and governments is that they try to come up with a single model that captures the complexity of athlete development, which I think is flawed from the perspective, not so much from the people that are designing the model, because I think they're quite thoughtful and insightful, and they're trying to provide some kind of policy document that practitioners can use to allocate resources or to focus on coaching priorities and those kinds of things. But what it does is it provides a simple solution to a complicated problem. And so Canada's long-term athlete development model, Australia's FTEM, those things are great in principle, but when they're used in practice, they look for people that are going to fit that framework instead of focusing on the outliers. And so when we said it's not an equation to be solved, it's the equation to be solved element suggests that there's a single equation, just as focusing on FTEM or LTAD suggests that there's a single model. A more fruitful approach from our perspective is there's 1,000 equations. You need to figure out what the right one is for your athlete. And you need to do that in an honest and realistic way in the sports system that you're in. If you've got an athlete that, yeah, they could be something if you were able to devote 10 years to them, but you're a college coach and you only have 3 years that you can work with them, then are they really a good fit for your system? We need to have these honest discussions based on what we know about our athletes, the constraints of our current system, and the outcome that we're trying to predict within the window at which we're able to work. Right now, I think we're, again, the story of the entire book is oversimplification of a very complicated, nuanced process.
I was going to say that that comes back to your thesis in this section of the Occam's razor, simpler but no simpler.
Yeah.
Simple but no simpler. It was kind of wrong word here, but go with it. Abusing that, we're kind of saying we're doing things. If you've got a simple model through your system, the problem is it's probably too simple, because it would require, as you say, hundreds or thousands of models. It's just too complex for that.
And I think that's been our goal in our research program, is to try to provide evidence for the progressive coach, the creative coach, to be able to push back against that approach that there's a one size fits all strategy. Because more and more the national sport governing bodies are trying to impose very strict guidelines for athlete development, very clear pathways for athlete development. And we think that the noise has meaning. And so if we can provide some evidence and some empirical evidence, but some theoretical approaches that emphasize the variability instead of the stability, then we can provide some ammunition for progressive coaches to push back.
I love this book. I'm going to strongly recommend it to as many people as possible. What's next for you with regard the topic of this book? Are you back at base, frantically researching lots of different areas that you reference in this book? Is that what's happening in your working life right now?
Yeah, that is where we're frantically working at the moment. It's around the psychology of coaches and the selection decisions that they make. So I think we're at the point, and we understand the concept enough to be able to do a bit more of a deeper dive into, well, why do coaches think the way they do? And so getting into this cognitive bias, all the different, cognitive biases that have been identified, it makes sense that some of them are going to show up in coaching environments. And so we're trying to identify those kinds of things. Identification is the starting point, and then a correction and education is where we're hoping to go.
Well, Joe, I can't thank you enough for this conversation. It's been absolutely brilliant. Your book, Tyranny of Talent, How It Compels and Limits Athletic Achievement and Why You Should Ignore It. Tell us where people can get it from. I assume it was where you purchase your books. But as importantly, how can people follow you and discover more of your work and about your work?
At the moment, the book is available on Amazon as a Kindle and paperback. We've published it through there because our goal was to keep the price point low so that more coaches were able to access it. The Audible version I'll be recording over the
Oh,
holidays,
brilliant.
so that's coming soon.
Okay.
You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Baker J York U. Send me an email, any questions, any feedback. This is an area that we're actively researching in. We don't think we have all the answers, but we think we are asking important and reasonable questions. So, yeah, we're always open for feedback and for a chat.
Are you doing the Audible yourself? Are you limbering up your vocal cords?
That's why it's taking so long. I've got to. I put it out on Twitter, and it seemed like people wanted it in the author's voice.
Yeah.
So yeah, which is kind of a waking nightmare for me, but we'll get it done.
You're a better man than me, Joe. I didn't do mine, so I don't think they wanted to listen to my dulcet tones anymore. Thank you so much for your time, Joe.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that conversation, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. I'd be delighted to hear any suggestions that you might have. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.